just so everybody's aware when they start singing. I think they do sing the national anthem today, but if they do, I have to mute it, just so you know. So the national anthem isn't copywritten, but it gets flagged as being copywritten, so it'll demonetize my video for a month while I dispute it. So it's just not even worth it. I just mute it. Yeah, I know. I lost on one of my videos. I let them sing the national anthem and I didn't mute it, and I ended up losing all my ad revenue for it. And it took me a month to get it released.
Be open, que l'on ouvre les portes. No, excusez-moi. I'd like to recognize the honourable member from South Okanagan, West Kootenay, who will be leading us in the national anthem.
O Canada, our home and native land. Porter le pays, il sait porter la croix. God keep our land glorious and free. Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Que l'on ouvre les portes, let the doors be open. Thank you, Alexa. If I could have your attention, please. Statements by members. Déclaration de député, l'honorable député de Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are facing unthinkable levels of climate crisis events globally. Scientists are alarmed, and so should we be all. It's very clear that last year, 2023, was the warmest year on record. Also, it's now clear for Canadians what we all knew. Records have been smashed, records have been broken, and that this winter was the warmest winter on record in Canada. And according to senior climatologists, the warmest year on record by a stunning margin. And it's not just the land that's hotter and drier, it's the oceans. I refer members to a recent article in the New Yorker by Elizabeth Colbert. Why is the sea so hot? Temperatures in our oceans reached a shade below 70 degrees Fahrenheit globally, and since the start of 2024, they're going up. Are we?
The honourable member from Scarborough North.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to recognize the 50th anniversary of Burner Trail Junior Public School in Scarborough North. Since opening its doors in 1973, the esteemed institution has shaped the lives of countless students, parents, teachers, and staff. Honoring their school motto, Better Together, students past and present are reconnecting and reminiscing over fond memories and moments. The commitment and dedication of educators, parents, and community members have undoubtedly contributed to decades of excellence in education. Indeed, the name of the school is derived from C.H. Burner Public School, a single-room red brick schoolhouse at Finch Avenue East and Nielsen Road that dates to 1872. Today, Burner Trail's legacy continues with the vibrant and diverse student population located in the heart of the Malvern community. Congratulations to Principal Jamie Walsh and the entire school community on reaching this remarkable milestone, wishing them many more years of success. Next.
The honourable member from Edmonton-Wetaskiwin.
Mr. Speaker, Helen Keller once said, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." And in that spirit today, I'm going to pay tribute to two organizations making a fantastic impact across Canada. First, March is Easter Seals Month, and a great time to recognize the wonderful work that Easter Seals Canada has done for over 100 years in Canada. Easter Seals' vision is to fully enhance the quality of life, well-being, and independence of Canadians living with disabilities, and they are consistently a leading and reliable partner in efforts to do just that. Also, in this Marvel-like universe of inclusion champions is Special Olympics Canada, who hosted their 2024 Winter Games in Calgary at the end of February. It was incredible to see thousands of athletes, volunteers, and families descend on our province of Alberta for the week of intense competition, joyful celebration, and powerful community engagement. To all of the superheroes at Easter Seals and Special Olympics, thank you for the life-changing work that you do every single day. You are truly unstoppable.
The honourable member from Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, I invite everyone to join us in Kitchener-Conestoga on Saturday, April 6th, as we celebrate the 60th annual Elmira Maple Syrup Festival. Since its start in 1965, the festival has grown to become the largest single-day maple syrup festival in the world. The community of Elmira, with a population of 12,000, will welcome up to 80,000 guests. Individuals and families can take part in the pancake flipping contest, family fun arena, live music, toy and craft show, and of course enjoy pancakes drenched in maple syrup. Thank you to the Elmira Maple Syrup Festival Committee for your dedication. Thanks to the sponsors for your financial support, and thanks to the volunteers who work tirelessly to make this festival happen. All proceeds are returned to our community's charitable and not-for-profit organizations. So from the morning breakfast to entering a team in the pancake flipping contest, to savoring the food, supporting the vendors, and enjoying artists, I know that my family and everyone will have a great day at the Elmira Maple Syrup Festival. See you there.
The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, Jean Ferrat sang, "How life is so beautiful," and today I would say the francophonie is so beautiful. Around the world, the francophonie is a living force, which gives culture its wings and creates dialogue between them. It's poetry, literature, values, living together, from Morocco to Louisiana, from Quebec to Belgium, from Côte d'Ivoire to Tahiti, from Vietnam to Mauritius. It's everywhere. David Cherami in Louisiana and Patrice Desbiens in Sudbury each have their own way of writing poetry in French. Aimé Césaire, poet, dramatist, and essayist, has also expressed the francophonie. And Dany Laferrière, our very own immortal, who makes us all feel so proud. And the francophonie also promises us a better world based on youth, joy, and friendship. And thanks to its unique timbre, French creates a sense of celebration in our hearts, in our souls, in our very beings. So I would like to wish all of you happy and immortal day of the francophonie.
Député d'Orléans.
Mr. Speaker, today is March 20th, International Day of the Francophonie. I'd like to thank all of the Francophone organizations and institutions throughout our country and in my community of Orléans for the hard work they've put into helping our language thrive. I'd also like to recognize two Francophone leaders in Orléans, Nicole and Louis Patry, who received the Champlain Prize for the Francophonie 2024 at the Francophonie Gala. And on March 1st, I celebrated International Women's Day with 120 exceptional women from Orléans, who all came to my annual lunch. I also had the honor of recognizing 38 women and girls by giving them the Orléans Leadership Award for Women and Girls for 2024. Thank you to everyone. Congratulations and happy Francophonie Day.
From Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to congratulate the Holy Trinity Catholic High School 3A boys basketball team who took home gold last week at the 2024 Alberta School Athletic Association Provincial Championships. This is a historic accomplishment for the Knights Nation as they become the first team north of Edmonton to ever bring home a provincial basketball title. The Knights rallied together, overcoming all odds to secure their victory in a game-winning free throw in overtime on home turf. Wow. I want to thank Principal Luann Demers, Vice Principal Athletics Kevin Garbuya, the coaching team, parents, volunteers, and of course, the amazing athletes who brought this all together. Your hard work and teamwork have paid off, and you've made your school and your entire community so proud. Go, Knights, go!
Yeah! The honourable member from Kitchener South, Hespeler.
Mr. Speaker, this coming Sunday, March 24th, is World Tuberculosis Day. TB is the leading infectious disease killer in the world, only briefly passed by COVID-19 at the height of the pandemic. As an airborne disease, TB can spread rapidly, and it can be deadly unless properly treated. In 2022 alone, 1.3 million people lost their lives to TB, and millions more were infected. In January 2023, I had the opportunity to travel with Results Canada to Kenya. I saw firsthand how Canadian international assistance is efficiently and effectively used to fight TB. Dedicated community health workers and local organizations are tireless in ensuring people receive the safe and dignified treatment they need to recover from TB. Yesterday morning, I had the honor to co-host a parliamentary breakfast where parliamentarians from all parties came together to hear from leading expert and passionate advocates who stand united in their vision of a world without TB. There's more to be done, but with effort and political will.
L'honorable député de Nickel Belt.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to celebrate Dietitians Day in Canada. Household food security is top of mind for many Canadians. Dietitians work hard to empower the health of individuals and communities. They are regulated health professionals who support children and adults with many illnesses such as diabetes in developing a healthy eating plan that regulates blood sugar. Dietitians work directly with other healthcare professionals, undertake scientific research, drive innovation, and inform public policy.
Malnutrition has profound repercussions on people's physical and mental health. Dietitians within our health network can have a real positive impact. They ensure that people have the resources they need to make healthier food choices, both for urban Canadians, rural Canadians, people with specific needs, and Indigenous people. Let's recognize the importance of this profession in creating a healthier nation. Thank you very much to all our dietitians.
The honourable member from Brantford Brant.
Mr. Speaker, this government's track record in following basic rules is not just disappointing, it's downright disgusting.
That's right.
And now, after a 16-month study at Government Operations Committee, today the government announces new measures to identify fraudulent billing cases. $5 million so far has been identified involving 3 subcontractors billing 36 different federal departments. This dates back to 2018, Mr. Speaker. New ways of fraudulent billing will soon be uncovered. The RCMP have received referrals. What took this government so long, and when will Canadian taxpayers get their money back?
L'honorable député, the honourable member from Mount Royal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today marks the 38th anniversary of the Mad Science Group. Founded in 1987 by youthful visionaries Ron Schlein and his brother Ariel, the Mad Science Group has evolved into a national gem that has ignited the spirits of countless young minds across Canada and beyond. Mad Science has fundamentally altered how children engage with STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Through awe-inspiring experiments and immersive encounters, it has kindled flames of curiosity and nurtured an unwavering love of learning. Mad Science not only impacts young learners, but also serves as a platform for career-oriented employment, having empowered over 70,000 passionate individuals to share their fervor for knowledge. As we commemorate 38 glorious years, let us extend gratitude to the contributing visionaries, educators, and supporters. Their tireless efforts have transformed countless lives. I am proud to honor Mad Science, especially my friends Ron and Ariel Schlein. May you continue to demystify science for future generations and illuminate their path of discovery.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
Good job.
The honourable member from Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Mr. Speaker, the government cannot give anyone anything that they did not first take from someone else.
Right.
In the case of the carbon tax and the so-called rebate, the government's literally taking from one pocket and putting it to the other, but not before stuffing their own. Canadians are smart enough to recognize a scam when they see it. This carbon tax shell game, well, it's gone on for long enough. The facts are in, the verdict is here. The PBO has said that Ontario families are paying $1,647 while only getting a rebate of about $1,000. Wow. That means every Canadian Ontario family is short $600. In Cobourg, volunteers at a local warming center have told me that for the first time ever, they have clients who have full-time jobs, who can't afford to do anything else because they can't afford food and they can't access shelter. We need a Canada that works for those who do the work. Yeah. 7 premiers, 70% of Canadians agree. They're opposed to carbon tax. It's time to vote non-confidence. It's time to spike the hike, and it's time to axe the tax.
The honourable member from Chilliwack Hope.
British Columbians pay the highest gas prices in Canada thanks to punishingly high taxes, with the cost of gas going to over $2 a litre this week. On April 1st, these Liberals and their BC NDP toadies will push prices even higher with a 23% hike on the carbon tax, driving the cost of gas, groceries, and home heating to record highs. Many British Columbians are struggling to put food on their table and keep a roof over their heads, and now the Liberals, with the help of the BC NDP, are going to make life even more expensive. Nearly 200,000 people in BC use food banks in a single month. They cannot afford another tax increase. But BC NDP Premier David Eby is only too happy to do the Prime Minister's bidding and impose this made-in-Ottawa Liberal NDP carbon tax hike on British Columbians. Only common-sense Conservatives are speaking up for the people of BC who are saying enough is enough. Their message, like ours, is to spike the hike or call a carbon tax election.
The Honourable Member for London West. Today is International Day of the Francophonie, and I would like to speak about the vibrant Franco-Ontarian community in London and throughout the world. Let me just mention some numbers. French is an official language in 29 countries. There are 450 million Francophones throughout the world. I am a proud Franco-Ontarian, and I would like to mention the fact that Franco-Ontarians have made important contributions to our country. They have contributed a great deal to the Francophone culture in Canada outside Quebec. Thanks to Francophones in London, we have 2 Francophone school boards in 10 schools. We have resources to help new arrivals to thrive in French. I would like to thank all of the organizations that are working hard to support our community. I would like to thank and congratulate all Francophones in London, Ontario, and Canada.
Member from Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, Donna, Sheila, and Julie are 3 women who have given me permission to share their stories. They are among the 27 screening officers at the Victoria Airport who recently lost their jobs. CATSA, the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, disqualified these workers, forcing their employer to fire them despite the employer wanting to keep them on. Donna is a single mom with 2 kids. She's extremely worried about how she's going to make rent next month. Sheila has had to search for a new home for her family in a housing crisis. Julie lives with a disability. She's been a loyal employee with CUTSA for 16 years. She was given no right to appeal. The infractions cited were as small as not looking under a bottle lid. They were never given any warnings. They weren't offered more training. These workers deserve better. CATSA's decision to disqualify unionized workers without due process undermines collective bargaining. All these screening officers are keen to return to work. I'm urging the Labour Minister to investigate this matter and find answers the employees deserve.
The Honourable Member for Beauport, Côte-Beaupré, Île-d'Orléans, Charlevoix. We have some wonderful visitors here on the Hill today, Mr. Speaker. More than a dozen mayors have all come to see us on the Hill, and just having them here from such a beautiful riding reminds me of the river, the hills, the islands, and everything that makes the riding so incredible. And maybe this is an opportunity to partially repair the unfortunate remarks that have been made recently and instead congratulate our municipal elected officials on their very hard work. After all, it's no easy task. They have to show rigor, leadership, in-depth knowledge on the ground, and of laws and regulations. They must also show empathy, kindness, and courage. For me and my colleagues in the bloc, it is very important to underscore their commitment and express our gratitude, admiration, and our support, because they stand at the very heart of our towns and villages. Hats off to our elected officials at the municipal level, and I hope that they all enjoy their stay among us.
The Honourable Member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
After 8 years, this Liberal NDP Prime Minister and his carbon tax scam are not worth the cost as Canadians get poorer. 2 million Canadians visit a food bank in a single month, with 1 million more projected to this year. Yet these climate zealots will hike the carbon tax 23% on April the 1st, making the cost of everything more expensive. The PBO proved that Canadians pay more into this scam than what they get back in these phony rebates. 70% of premiers and Canadians reject this carbon tax scam, including Liberal premiers. That's why our common sense Conservative leader is calling a no confidence vote on this Liberal NDP Prime Minister to spike the hike. Will the Liberal lapdog NDP and inflationist bloc stand with a majority of Canadians and common sense Conservatives to call on this Prime Minister to spike the hike, or will they continue to support the scam? It's time for a carbon tax election so Canadians can scrap this Prime Minister and Conservatives can axe the tax.
The Honourable Member for Laval-les-Îles. Mr. Speaker, the Reverend Father Hadi Mahfouz is an eminent personage for all Lebanese people, especially for Maronite Christians. He became the leader of the Maronite Order in 2022. He speaks a number of languages: Arabic, French, English, Italian, Spanish, and German. He has published many books and articles on Bible exegesis. He has created a relationship between the Holy Spirit University of Catholic and the University of Montreal, especially HEC Montreal. And there are a number of programs and diplomas that exist in collaboration between the two. In 2016, he became the director of the monastic order, and ever since, he has shown his exemplary leadership and transparent personality. He is serving all Lebanese people of all faiths throughout the world. Thank you.
Oral questions. Questions orales. L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. The common sense Conservatives have a plan to cut taxes, build the homes, fix the budget, stop the crime. However, the costly Prime Minister, with the support of the Bloc Québécois, is inflating inflation with taxes and deficits, and the Prime Minister wants even greater tax hikes on the 1st of April. Will the Prime Minister inverse his inflationary policies, or are we going to have to defeat him with a no-confidence vote and an election on taxes? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. The carbon remittance puts more money in the pockets of 8 out of 10 families under federal jurisdiction. we give more families to families whilst fighting against climate change, Mr. Speaker. That's what the vast majority of Canadians want. Unfortunately, however, the Conservative politicians don't want to help affordability. They don't want to help fighting climate change. Luckily, the majority in this House wants to fight against climate change and give more money to Canadians, and that is what we are trying to do. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. That's quite the opposite compared to what the Parliamentary Budget Officer said on the 18th of March. He said, when we consider the economic impacts of the carbon tax, most families will pay more and be negatively impacted by the carbon tax. So what the Prime Minister said is simply not true. Canadians will pay more than what they receive. And there's a second carbon tax that is directly applicable on the backs of Quebecers. So will the Bloc Québécois vote for Quebec families, or will they vote again for their real boss, the Prime Minister of the Federal Government of Canada? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition stopped talking and started listening to Canadians, he would understand that Canadians know that the cost of inaction with regards to climate change are huge. Forest fires, floodings, droughts that cost a lot to our farmers and producers, our fishers. This is a reality, and we are fighting against this on this side of the House, whilst putting more money in the pockets of 8 out of 10 families throughout the country. The carbon remittance delivers for Canadian families, and the Conservative Party wants to take it away from Canadian families.
Then I have chef de l'opposition.
While common sense Conservatives will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost, with the Parliamentary Budget Officer testifying again that the majority of households will see a negative impact as a result of the carbon tax. End quote. Now he wants to hike the tax on April Fool's Day. We won't stand for it. So what will it be with this Prime Minister? Will he spike the hike, or will he face a non-confidence vote and a carbon tax election?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report lays out clearly that 8 out of 10 Canadian families across the country where the price on pollution applies get more money back every year. That's how we put more money in the pockets of Canadians while having one of the strongest plans to fight climate change around the world. That's what the Conservative Party is standing against right now. Money in the pockets of Canadian families and a real plan to fight climate change that is working, Mr. Speaker, that is bringing down emissions, that is making us more competitive, that is helping build the future.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, I'm going to read again the testimony from the March 18th appearance of the Parliamentary Budget Officer. Once you factor in the rebate, but also the economic impacts, the majority of households will see a negative impact as a result of the carbon tax. End quote. The Prime Minister plans to make this problem worse with a carbon tax hike on heat, on homes, on fuel, on food. We will not stand for it. So once again, which will it be? Will he spike the hike, or will we have a carbon tax election?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
What will it be, Mr. Speaker? It will be that Canadians get more money with the Canada carbon rebate. 80% of Canadian households in areas where the federal carbon tax applies get more money every year from the Canada carbon rebate than they pay in the price on pollution. On top of that, we are fighting climate change, making our industries more competitive, and preparing a better future. There is no plan on the Conservative side of the House to either help Canadians with rebate checks or fight climate change.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, not only did the Parliamentary Budget Officer testify that the majority of households will pay more in carbon taxes than they will get back in rebates, there is a table showing that every single province in which this tax applies, the middle-class families pay vastly more than they get back, and Canadians know it, because under this Prime Minister, they've seen their food, their fuel, their homes, their heating go through the roof. But why don't we just end the debate and let Canadians Canadians decide and have a carbon tax election.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the Parliamentary Budget Officer clearly spelled out that 8 out of 10 Canadian families in areas where the price on pollution applies get more money back every year than they pay in the price on pollution. That's because we created a plan that not only is one of the strongest plans to fight climate change in the world, but it puts more money back in the pockets of middle-class Canadians as we build a stronger future, better careers, more competitiveness, and a safer environment for generations to come. That's the plan we have. That's not what they're doing.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Yesterday, the Prime Minister told a great joke. He said how well he collaborates with the Premier of Quebec. However, the facts show that everyone in the National Assembly of Quebec, except the Liberals, are asking that Quebec have full powers with regards to immigration. The Prime Minister of Canada has refused an essential request from Quebec. Is that how he sees Canada's friendship with Quebec? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague knows full well that Quebec has more powers in immigration than any other province. And he knows full well that I spoke last Friday with Premier Legault to say, yes, let us work together to reach our objectives, our common objectives. We are here to help companies. We are here to make sure that services are available. We are here to help with housing. We will work hand in hand with Quebec, as we have always done. We are here to deliver for Quebecers and all Canadians all together. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. If the Prime Minister is here to deliver for Quebecers, well, it's just another failure on his part. The government of Quebec has paid for education, for healthcare, for income supplements, and childcare. The Liberal governments said, yes, pay up front and we'll reimburse you later. The bill is up to $1 billion, and now Quebec has a huge deficit because of this, and now the federal government is saying, deal with it, because I'm not going to give you my $1 billion. You're my friend, but go right on home. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. I would be very careful if I was the leader of the Bloc, because he seems to think that there are more Quebecers on his side of the house than ours. We speak on behalf of Quebecers, we represent Quebecers, and we're here to work hand in hand to deliver results for Quebecers. With regards to health, we are working very hard to make sure that there are improvements in healthcare services. The federal government is here to disburse billions upon billions of dollars for Quebec priorities. We are here to work together and will continue to do so throughout this House as Quebecers.
The Honourable Member from Edmonton-Griesbach.
First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities across Canada are slipping further behind. Kids can't access health services and homes are falling apart. But what are the Liberals doing? Threatening to cut billions in services communities rely on. And if it were up to the Conservative leader, Indigenous services would be gutted altogether. The Liberals and Conservatives seem to always find ways to make rich CEOs even richer, but never find money for real people. Will the Prime Minister honour his commitments to Indigenous people or leave them out to dry?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are unequivocally committed and have been since 2015 to working in partnership with First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities across the country to advance self-determination and reconciliation. We have tripled investments in Indigenous housing, mental health, access to clean drinking water and jobs to contribute to economic reconciliation. We also move forward to compensate First Nations children and families who suffered under the discriminatory child welfare system. We've built over 30,000 homes since 2016, and we recently announced that we will move forward in creating an Indigenous loan support program. There is, of course, much more to do, but we will keep doing it.
The Honourable Member from Edmonton-Griesbach.
Mr. Speaker, that answer is little comfort to the residential school survivors and children who rely on those services. Imagine having to live in a moldy home with your young children knowing that it isn't a healthy place for them. That's the heartbreaking situation First Nations are facing across the country. The Auditor General says herself that this government has no plan to close the housing gaps that they're keeping First Nations in inhumane conditions. Shame. When will the Prime Minister take First Nations housing seriously and provide the communities with the resources they desperately need?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
We have made historic investments in housing in Indigenous communities after decades of wrongful underfunding by previous governments of all stripes. And we are working every single day to do more. We're committed to working in partnership with First Nations and their communities. We thank the Auditor General for her work and her report, and we'll continue to move forward to do even more in partnership with Indigenous people across this country.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Parties, there's been an outbreak of common sense on the carbon tax. In fact, Nova Scotia Liberals, NDPers, and Conservatives passed a unanimous motion in their legislature this week calling on their federal MPs to vote against the Prime Minister's 23% carbon tax hike. No wonder. The cost of the carbon tax to the average Nova Scotia family will be $1,605 according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer. $1,605. How much will be the rebate for the average family?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the federal price on pollution is a backstop. It's a system that we put in place to both fight climate change everywhere across the country and put more money back in the pockets of Canadian families where it applies. Every single province had and continues to have the option to replace the federal price on pollution with their own program as long as it is as rigorous and stringent as the federal price on pollution. As long as they have a plan to fight climate change, they can do what they want as long as it's strong enough. That's the options the provinces have. So they can take that option. We're going to keep putting...
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
That's demonstrably false because Nova Scotia actually has a climate change plan, which he rejected and overrode with a federal carbon tax that is opposed by New Democrats, Liberals, and Conservatives unanimously in the province's legislature. But you notice he wouldn't answer my question. He's been bragging about these rebates. But then when we talk about the cost, all of a sudden he forgets the rebates. So I'm going to give him a second chance. In the province of Nova Scotia, the cost to the average family will be $1,500. $1,500. $1,500 per Nova Scotia family. How much is the rebate?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, that is simply not true. The reality is, for 8 out of 10 families right across the country in backstop provinces, families do better off with the Canada carbon rebate than they do with the extra costs of the price on pollution. This is a plan to fight climate change, but it's also a plan to put more money in the pockets of families from coast to coast to coast. Now, the Conservative leader doesn't care about fighting against climate change, and he doesn't care about affordability either, because he would rip up the rebate checks and he would do less on fighting climate change. We're going to keep delivering for Canadians.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Still won't answer the question. All the Liberal ministers came in with little cue cards a week ago with all these rebates on them. They were waving them around, very proud. And then when we went to the Parliamentary Budget Officer and said, give us the full price by province, and we quoted that, for example, in Nova Scotia, it's $1,500 in cost to the average family, according to the PBO. Again, $1,500 in costs. What is the rebate? The number.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we see the lengths to which the Conservative Party will go to mislead Canadians about a plan that fights climate change and puts more money in the pockets out of 8 or 10 Canadian families. The Parliamentary Budget Office officer himself admitted and said that you cannot take his words out of context because he did not calculate the costs of inaction on fighting climate change. He did not calculate the competitive advantages of the innovation and the solutions and the economic growth that comes with putting a price on pollution. The Conservative Party are not telling the full story.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, he did not, the Parliamentary Budget Officer did not include the cost of climate change because the carbon tax doesn't address the cost of climate change. The Parliamentary Budget Officer made clear the carbon tax will do nothing to change the cost of climate change, and that's why the tax costs more for every family in every province. So let's go to Alberta, where two of the NDP leadership candidates have come out against the carbon tax, and the Prime Minister's only friend in the province, Naheed Nenshi, has gone totally silent. Albertans will pay $2,900 in carbon tax per family. What will be the rebate for them?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, $1,800 a year is the average, is the family of four in Alberta Canada carbon rebate. That is helping them, and according to an analysis by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, is more than they pay in extra price on pollution because of the price we put into the federal level. The price on pollution puts more money in the pockets out of 8 of 10 Canadian families and fights climate change while building a stronger, more competitive future. The Conservatives have no plan to fight climate change and no plan to help Canadians with rebate checks.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
All right, he found his cue card, and he finally talked about the rebate. So he says the average family in Alberta will get $1,800 while they pay $2,943. In other words, next year alone, after this forthcoming hike, the average Alberta family will pay $1,100 more in carbon taxes than he gives back in his phony checks. Will the Prime Minister tell us if he understands that $2,900 is bigger than $1,800?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, how about a different stat? A stat that the Finance Ministry analyzed turns out that for an average income quintile group, the average household of 2.5 Canadians, average net benefit per household in Alberta, $723 a year. Wow. That's $723 in the pockets of the average Albertan family because we put a price on pollution that puts more money back in the pockets out of 8 out of 10 Canadian families. That is what we are doing. That's how we fight climate change.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
He wants you to know, Mr. Speaker, he has alternative facts. I get mine from the Parliamentary Officer that reports directly to Parliament and is independent. He's using numbers that come from officials that report to him and depend on him for their job. So let's take another province, Ontario, where the Liberal leader has now come out against this Prime Minister's carbon tax. Maybe she knows that the average cost to an Ontario family of the federal carbon tax is $1,674 for this coming year. How much is the rebate in Ontario?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The average net benefit per household in Ontario is $255 a year. Wow. That is fighting climate change while putting more money in the pockets of Canadians. The Parliamentary Budget Officer himself demonstrated that 8 out of 10 Canadian families in regions that get the carbon price backstop do better with the price on pollution, put more money back in their pockets than it costs them on the fight for climate change. This is the plan we're delivering for Canadians. That's the plan he wants to scrap.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, I don't really believe in polls, so let's not stop talking about polls. But at the end of the day, the Prime Minister should realise that he needs to realise who speaks for who. In all polls, for the longest time, the Bloc has always been ahead of the Liberals. If the Prime Minister is so low in the polls, so low that even the Conservatives are in front of them in Canada is perhaps because they don't respect Quebec, Quebecers, or the National Assembly of Quebec. Does he believe that this strategy is good because he knows that he is never going to gain any more in Quebec, or does he just do it because harming Quebec is a good look for the rest of Canada? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Canadians know full well that in democracy there is one poll that counts, and that's the actual election day. Over the past 3 elections, the Liberal Party has garnered more seats in Quebec than the Bloc Québécois because we are here to actually deliver tangible results for Quebecers and all Canadians with health agreements, with dental health, for help for seniors, with $6 billion for childcare in Quebec, with investments that help to create economic growth, jobs for the future for Quebecers, and a greener world for all. These are the investments we do to represent Quebec and will continue to deliver, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Bailleul-Chambly. I think that there's a bit of vulnerability coming through. The Liberals don't know if they'll be sat on their side or the other side after the next elections. If they really want to listen to Quebecers, if they really want to pretend that they're listening to Quebecers, they will give more immigration powers to Quebec. They will invest more in Quebec healthcare. At the moment, they're doing nothing, and all they do is read the pre-prepared cards. Will the Prime Minister finally at least pretend to do his job for Quebecers? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Let's talk about tangible facts, Mr. Speaker. 1.5 million Canadians and seniors have now registered to our dental plan. Dental plans against which the Conservatives voted, by the way. Over a third of these seniors are from Quebec. That's hundreds of thousands of senior Quebecers who will finally get dental care for free thanks to the federal government's investments in healthcare. We are here to deliver for Quebecers. We'll always be here for Quebecers and all Canadians. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Now the legislature in Newfoundland and Labrador has acknowledged that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. After 8 years, they passed a motion supported by the Liberal Premier and personal friend of the Prime Minister to oppose the April 1st tax hike. They must have heard from the Parliamentary budget officer that the cost to Newfoundlanders of the carbon tax this year will be $1,874. $1,874 for the average Newfoundland and Labrador family. What will their rebate be?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the average net benefit per household in Newfoundland and Labrador is $303 a year. That's the money that they pocket with our price on pollution and the Canada carbon rebate checks that go into households across the province. The province is open to creating its own price on pollution, its own plan to fight climate change. As long as it's as strong as the federal backstop, they're welcome to do that if they want to do it a different way. But for the meantime, we're going to both fight climate change and deliver more money to the families in Newfoundland and Labrador.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
So here are the facts from the Parliamentary Budget Officer. They're directly from him. The cost to the average Newfoundland family is $1,874. The rebate is $1,497 for a net cost of $377. A net loss of $377 and growing. These are the facts. The Prime Minister stopped denying the facts, and if he really wants to contest and argue that he should be able to raise the tax, why doesn't he have the courage to call an election and let Canadians decide?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, we are busy delivering for Canadians a price on pollution that puts more money in the pockets out of 8 out of 10 families across the country. And an election on the price on pollution, we had 3, Mr. Speaker, and we won them all.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. One more.
Wow. shouldn't be afraid to have one more. Costs. He sent 2 million people lining up at food banks, 8,000 joining a Facebook group learning how they can eat a meal out of a dumpster, and now his best solution is to hike the tax on their heat, on their homes, on their fuel, on their food. If he really believes in it, why doesn't he call a carbon tax election now?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, we've heard time and time again over these past many months the Leader of the Opposition talk about how Canada is broken. Well, Mr. Speaker, we are focused on supporting Canadians with things like childcare and dental care and a plan to fight climate change that puts more money in the pockets out of 8 of 10 Canadian families right across the country. That is the approach that is delivering for Canadians, and we've still got more work to do, and we're going to keep doing it to deliver for Canadians every single day we're in this House.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Finance Minister claimed that the carbon tax was revenue neutral, that it gave back, that the government didn't keep a single penny. Well, it turns out they keep hundreds of billions of pennies. They've collected so far $20.7 billion and only paid back $18.6 billion. In other words, they profited by over $2 billion by pillaging the pockets of Canadians. When will the Canadian people get their $2 billion back? And if he's sure about taking it away, why doesn't he call an election to defend it?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader is now complaining about $2 billion that he would never give to Canadian businesses, would never give to Canadians, because he would scrap the Canada carbon rebate. We are actually delivering money across the country to communities, to individuals, to small businesses, to Indigenous communities, to fight climate change and help afford their groceries. He wants to eliminate the carbon rebate. He wants to eliminate the plan to fight climate change. He has no plan for the future of the economy.
L'honorable député de Rosemont, la Petite Patrie.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is first. Number one, the Liberals should be proud. Wait, but we're first in what? Air pollution, Mr. Speaker. For the first time, Canada is the most polluted country in North America. We're worse than the United States. With the climate crisis and forest fires, people are suffocating and choking. It makes them sick. People are dying, and it's only going to get worse. Is the Minister of the Environment proud to represent the most polluted country in North America? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. I understand this makes a nice video clip for the NDP. We're talking about forest fires. Yes, last year, forest fires were horrendous. The truth is that we have to do even more to fight against climate change. But we have the Conservative Party that wants to take a step back on the fight against climate change. They want to get rid of the rebates we're giving to Canadians. And the NDP never has had a plan when we have been there with concrete action. We'll continue to be there to protect Canadians.
The Honourable Member from Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government continues to fail women, including care workers in women's shelters. And the cuts to women's shelters have not only impacted women fleeing violence, but also shelter workers who are facing a burnout crisis, consistently overworked and underpaid. 75% of the care economy are women. This is a gender equality issue. Why does the so-called feminist Liberals stop wasting millions on private consultants and invest in fair wages for shelter workers to help save lives?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have demonstrated from day one that we are there to work with the provinces to invest in the care economy, whether it's commitments to raise personal support worker wages to $25 an hour, whether it's our historic child care agreements that are creating wage grids for early childhood educators, whether it's moving forward on strengthening support for Indigenous communities and care workers in Indigenous communities and from Indigenous communities. We will continue to be there. We recognize there is more work to do, but we are there to do it hand in hand with the different jurisdictions across the country.
The honourable member from Vaughan Woodbridge.
Mr. Speaker, parents in my riding of Vaughan Woodbridge have been talking for years about what a hard time they're having finding daycare spaces for children, and that's why we put forward our early learning and child care bill, which the Conservative Party tried to delay. Can the Prime Minister update the House on the status of this important bill? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, childcare services are not only supports for parents but also for our economy. I'm so happy to see that with our support and the support of the member for Vaughan Woodbridge in our caucus, the Early Learning and Childcare Bill in Canada received royal assent yesterday. Unfortunately, the Conservative leader asked his members to obstruct and delay this bill. But in spite of this, we are keeping our promise to Canadians so that no matter where they live, they will have access to affordable child care that is inclusive and quality service. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Prime Minister is not worth the cost to our economy. Real per-person GDP has grown slower in Canada than all the rest of the G7. Dead last. In fact, our per capita GDP is smaller than it was 5 years ago, the worst record since the Great Depression, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer calculates that the carbon tax will blow an $18 billion hole in the size of our GDP, $1,000 in economic cost per family. If he really thinks that's worth the cost, why won't we have a carbon election to...
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, at the same time, our population is growing faster than other countries around the world, if you're going to be telling the full story. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, our price on pollution puts more money in the pockets of 8 out of 10 Canadian families in the backstop provinces. This is a fact recognized by the Parliamentary Budget Officer and recognized by Canadians who see both a real plan to invest in the jobs and careers of the future, the competitiveness that Canada needs, and the fight against climate change to keep us safe while putting more money in the pockets of Canadian families from coast to coast to coast.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The government gets bigger, the people get poorer. After 8 years, he's not worth the cost. He's blowing another $18 billion hole in our GDP with this carbon tax, a hole that will mean lower wages and a lower quality of life for the Canadian people. The Prime Minister now wants to quadruple the carbon tax, starting with his April Fool's Day hike. When will he realize that after 8 years of Canadians lining up in food banks and living in tents, he's not worth the cost?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the price on pollution returns every dollar that it collects to the jurisdictions in which it's collected. That is the fact that built our program, our fight against climate change. The reality is we're creating jobs, we're creating growth, and we're putting more money back in the pockets out of 8 out of 10 Canadian families in backstop provinces. This is the plan that fights climate change, builds a stronger economy, and supports Canadians right now with rebate checks that the Leader of the Opposition would cancel.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Based on his own main estimates and public accounts, he's collected over $20 billion in taxes and only returned $18 billion. So it is factually inaccurate to say that he's given every penny back. In fact, we know that in every single province where the carbon tax applies, Canadians pay more than they get back. And there is only one provincial party that supports the tax. The BC NDP is happily implementing this federally mandated tax grab. Will the Prime Minister today allow British Columbia to cancel the April Fool's Day tax hike?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in a question and a contrast on facts, the reality is the BC government has had a price on pollution since 2008, and the federal government has no involvement in British Columbia's price on pollution. It is a simple error of fact that the leader of the Conservative Party is trying to share with this House. He must be mistaken. Maybe it's an honest mistake, but the reality is he is wrong on the fact on that, just like he's wrong on the fact that he doesn't understand that 8 out of 10 Canadian families do better with the price on pollution.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Page 75 of the BC budget confirmed that they were bringing in the tax hike on April 1st because they're forced to by federal law. Yeah. And according to the Vancouver Sun, the NDP budget and fiscal plan presented in February says the carbon tax will raise $9 billion over 3 years. The New Democrats plan to give back $3.5 billion in climate action tax credits to low and middle income folks and spend the rest as they see fit. So will the Prime Minister end the carbon tax coalition with his provincial NDP BC counterparts so that British Columbians can get their money back?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
You'd think that for someone who's been railing against our plan to fight climate change and put more money in people's pockets for months now, he'd actually have done his research to understand how it works. Every single province has the ability to put forward their own plan to fight climate change as long as it is sufficiently rigorous to be fair to the other provinces that are also doing the same. That's what a Canada-wide plan to fight climate change is all about. Yes, the federal backstop gives back more money directly to Canadians in 8 out of 10 cases, but BC and others are free to do their own thing.
The Honourable Member for Leader of the Bloc Québécois. Mr. Speaker, seated in the middle of some 100 Liberal MPs that risk losing their jobs, the Prime Minister keeps interfering into provincial jurisdiction with his drug farm care policy that we already have in Quebec, but he refuses to increase OAS. Another example, well, we're not municipal funds with their collective funds. Municipalities can do what they want. The government wants to impose its own choices. Can he talk to the 12 mayors of Charlevoix, tell them that he'll take a step back and let them do their job? The Right Honourable Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, the Bloc leader is mistaken. We increased old age funds for seniors that are 70 years of age or older because they know we have higher costs than others. Yes, we recognize that even in Quebec, across the country, there are people who cannot pay for their medications for diabetes and their contraception because they're not covered. So we'll be here to work with Quebec to deliver for Canadians so that people can have their diabetes medications and their contraceptives. We'll be here to make sure people stay healthy. The Honourable Member for Ballet-Chambly. I don't know if seniors use a lot of contraceptives, but I know in Quebec, diabetes drugs are covered. He says, I don't know what I'm talking about. The collectivity fund, well, it should be up to the municipalities to do the work that they want. But the government that says it seems to be putting money into housing, and it's asking the municipalities to put money into housing. But can the government let the municipalities do what they want with their funding? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I think we do have challenges in terms of facts today. The Housing Accelerator Fund across the country actually helps municipalities by helping create more housing faster, except in Quebec, where we gave the Quebec government $900 million that they added to another $900 million for municipalities across Quebec to create housing faster. We are here to work respecting jurisdiction in partnership with Quebec to help both small and large municipalities across the province. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
This Prime Minister's catch and release policies and his mismanagement of our ports. Car thefts have gone up by over 200% in Toronto, 100% in Montreal. There are 12,000 cars stolen in Canada's biggest city every single year. That is one car stolen every 40 minutes. Will the Prime Minister accept my common sense plan to scan every shipping container, reinforce our ports, and put career car thieves behind bars?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, cracking down on auto theft starts with going after organized crime. $121 million for Ontario to crack down on organized crime and car theft, and the Conservative Party voted against it. Public Safety Minister announced $28 million for border services in collaboration with police across the country. And to stop organized crime, we're cracking down on money laundering, something the Conservative Party also voted against. We will take no lessons from the Conservative Party that chose to weaken our borders and pull money back from enforcement services any chance they got while they were in government.
They did that. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
We pulled money back from back office bureaucracy and costly consultants that now chew up the budget. CBSA is now spending $660 million on a Arrive scam, while only 5 CBSA officers are monitoring 500,000 shipping containers at the Port of Montreal. Conservatives put more CBSA agents on the front line at the Port of Montreal and across the country. Won't he accept my common sense plan to cut back on the consultants and put boots on the ground?
I'd like to ask the Honourable Member from New Westminster Burnaby, please, to allow the questions to be asked and for answers to be given without interruption. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The Conservative government in which that leader was a minister cut hundreds, if not thousands, of positions in law enforcement across the country, including CBSA officers. And those back office experts who actually analyzed the bills of lading and the origins to designate and to find out where these auto thefts are happening, which containers have stolen vehicles in them. We're investing in them. We're giving more money so they can do their work. The common sense is nonsense that the Leader of the Opposition is putting forward. We know that they are all about cuts, not investments to keep Canadians safe.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, why don't we just look at the CBSA's own numbers on this? In the first year of the Conservative government, there were a total of 12,673 CBSA officers. In the last year, there were 14,113. I know the Prime Minister's not great with numbers, but 14,000 is bigger than 12,000, right? And by the way, if he wants to analyze whether stolen cars are in shipping containers, why doesn't he accept my plan to scan those shipping containers? Wouldn't that be common sense?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'll let the Leader of the Opposition's high-priced corporate lobbyist friends who give him so much money at fancy catch for access private events explain to him the impact on supply chains and shipping in Canada to try and scan 600,000 containers a day, Mr. Speaker. The fact is, we are doing everything necessary to invest in countering organized crime, to track those containers and to do the work. He's not paying attention to the things that actually grow the country, even though he is listening to high-priced lobby.
The Honourable Member from Calgary Skyview.
Mr. Speaker, Calgary and my home province of Alberta is home to tens of thousands of proud Ukrainian Canadians. Since Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, Canada's commitment towards Ukraine has never been stronger, and it is why our government introduced a modernized Canada-Ukraine free trade agreement that President Zelensky asked for to be there to help Ukraine rebuild after they defeat Russia. Shamefully, the Conservative Party did not want to accept Ukraine's reasonable request for assistance. Can the Prime Minister update this House on this crucial trade agreement?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, after that Conservative leader turned his back on Ukrainians and forced his own caucus to do the same, he...
Colleagues, order, please. I'm going to ask the Prime Minister to start from the top.
Mr. Speaker, after that Conservative leader turned his back on Ukrainians and forced his own caucus to do the same, he whipped his senators last night to vote against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement that Ukraine asked for. Our Liberal caucus, including the member for Skyview, never backed down. Despite the Conservative Party's efforts to derail Ukraine's hopes to rebuilding after they win the war, the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement received royal assent last night. While Conservative politicians sell out to the Kremlin, we will stand with Ukraine.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The $60 million Arrive scam is just the tip of the iceberg. We now learn that there are $5 million in additional fraud that has been identified by the Department of Public Procurement. And this is out of the $21 billion the Prime Minister is now spending on outside consultants, a 100% increase, and fully with the support of the NDP. Can the Prime Minister tell us how much of this $21 billion is fraud?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The situation is obviously unacceptable, which is why authorities are looking into this procurement process. Anyone who took advantage of our COVID response to save Canadian lives should face consequence. All federal contracts with these companies have been suspended as the investigation continues. But everyone in this House noticed how quickly he pivoted from a question on Ukraine. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, his members are ashamed of him for forcing him to vote against Ukrainian Canadians.
I'd like to remind the Prime Minister, please, to make sure that questions and comments are directed through the Chair. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister demonstrates once again he is a fake and he is a phony, because he's a fake and
I'm going to remind the Honourable Leader of the Opposition is a very experienced member of Parliament, and I know that he would understand that that kind of a statement that directed to an individual would not be considered parliamentary. So I'll ask the Honourable Member to continue with this question.
The Prime Minister is a fake and a phony on this issue, just like on everything else. He sends...
The honourable member, again, is a very experienced member, and he knows that when the Speaker asks him to chastise us a little bit for the use of language which is not considered parliamentary, I'd ask him please to rephrase, to withdraw those comments, rephrase the question without using those words.
Mr. Speaker, this is a Prime Minister who authorized the export of gas turbines to pump gas from Putin's economy into Europe to fund the war. He's someone who signed on to allow Russian detonators to blow up Ukrainians on the battlefield, and he's a pro-Russia energy policy to fund the Russian economy. We'll take no less.
Prime Minister.
That is pretty weak sauce from the Leader of the Opposition. The reality is, President Zelensky.
I see that the opposition House Leader is asking members to be calm. I'm going to ask all House Leaders to please ask all of your members from all sides to be calm. So, and I'll ask in particular the member from Dufferin Caledon, please, to hold on until he has the time to speak. So, the Honourable Prime Minister, please.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is flailing in every way he can to try and divert the attention from the fact that his members voted against a request by President Zelensky himself to support a Canada-Ukraine free trade deal. The reality is his constituents across the country feel betrayed by the Conservative Party voting against Ukraine.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Ukrainians asked for us to give missiles that Conservatives support to Ukraine, not to give turbines and detonators to Russia, which is what he has done. He has failed Ukrainians abroad, and he's failed Canadians at home. Canadians are good and decent people. They don't have to live this way. They do not have to give up the things they used to take for granted, like affordable food and homes, all for the incompetence and ego of one man. He is not worth the cost or the corruption. Will he call a carbon tax election so Canadians can decide?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, notice how desperate he is to try and find any excuse he can to justify their voting against Ukraine. Suddenly, he's not talking about the price on pollution that Ukraine put in itself years ago. He's not using that as an excuse, even though that was all we heard as the justification for why they voted against Ukraine, voted against Ukrainian Canadians, voted against the reconstruction of Ukraine that we are committed to through a free trade agreement. He stood in this House and voted against Ukraine and is now trying to do anything he can to hide from it. He let down Ukraine, and that showed who he is.
Order.
The Honourable Member for Ottawa-Vanier.
Climate change is a reality that impacts my constituents in Ottawa-Vanier. They have asked for our government to reduce emissions while putting more money back in their pockets. That is why every year they receive $1,120 from the Canada carbon rebate. While conservative politicians fail to recognize that climate change is real and that there's an even greater cost of inaction, can the Prime Minister inform Canadians why our plan is so important?
I will just ask, well, we'll start again with 10 seconds for the question for the member for Ottawa-Vanier, but I would like to ask the member for Jacques-Cartier-Portneuf to retain himself while someone is asking questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While conservative politicians fail to recognize that climate change is real and that there is an even greater cost of inaction, can the Prime Minister inform Canadians why our plan is so important?
Hear, hear.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for Ottawa-Vanier for an important question and her hard work. The opposition leader would take away over $1,000 from families in Ontario every year. That amount might be minimal to him when he's cashing his CCB check, but not to middle-class families. But now we know why he wants to take money away from Canadians. He's in the pocket of big business. We learned from media reports that he was partying with oil lobbyists and CEOs at private Cash for Access fundraisers in Banff just last year. He cares about his wealthy donors getting richer. He doesn't care about Canadians.
The Honourable Member from Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Mr. Speaker, families in Nanaimo, Ladysmith, and across Canada should not have to worry about how to keep their kids fed while at school. A national school food program would make sure kids get the food they need to grow and learn. But the Liberals have been delaying for years. And what about the Conservatives? Well, they voted against feeding kids while putting the profits of CEOs first. Children should not be left to go hungry. Will the Prime Minister make sure a national school food program is in the spring budget?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, like all members in this House, they're going to have to wait until April 16th to find out what's in our budget. But I can give people a preview right now. There will be support on housing. There will be help on affordability for Canadians. There will be opportunities to invest in growing the economy and creating good jobs for the future while we help Canadians through tough times right now. We are focused on young people. We are focused on seniors. We're going to keep delivering, including by working with provinces on important programs like school food programs.
The Honourable Member from Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, thanks to the powerful advocacy of people with disabilities across the country, every MP in this House supported legislation meant to lift people with disabilities out of poverty. 9 months later, still no commitment from this government to fund what will be called the Canada Disability Benefit. When it came to MAID legislation, this government sure moved fast to make sure people with disabilities could die well. Will the Prime Minister show he's ready to ensure Canadians with disabilities live well by committing to a fully funded benefit by Budget 2024.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member is better than that question that he just asked. He knows that it's really important to be there to both protect people when they're most vulnerable and be there to support their wishes. That is something that is foundational in Canada. In regards to people living with disabilities, we have invested more in people with disabilities over the past 8 years than ever before, and there is more to do. We were very, very pleased to move forward on the Canada Disability Benefit, and we will have more to say in the coming months.
It being 3:23, the House will now proceed to the taking.
I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. There's an order from the House of Commons. I would ask all members. Order, please. What I was explaining to the member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier, who is rising on a point of privilege, is that the House has made a decision to move straight to the vote. We will have a vote, after which we can entertain questions of privilege. This is after the vote. This was at the request of the House of Commons, so we will have the vote immediately. So we will have the opportunity to talk after the vote. Once again, It being 3:23 p.m., the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion to concur in the fifth report of the Standing Committee on Science and Research. Call in the members.
Hi everybody, anyone that's new to the channel, please like and subscribe. We should be going into a vote, and they're going to be voting on the carbon tax, the opposition motion.
The question is as follows. Mr. Blanchet-Jonca, seconded by Mr. Beaulieu, moved that the fifth report of the Standing Committee on Science and Research, presented on Thursday, June 15th, 2023, be concurred in. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Ms. Tassi.
Ms. Tassi.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Chagger.
Ms. Chagger.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Scrow.
Ms. Scrow.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Madame Le Boutillier.
Madame Le Boutillier.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Martinez-Ferrada.
Madame Martinez-Ferrada.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Assassi.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Monsieur Yakano.
Monsieur Yakano.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Dogood.
Mr. Dogood.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur Robillard.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Mr. Zuberi.
Mr. Zuberi.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Ms. Sidhu Brampton South.
Ms. Sidhu Brampton South.
Mr. Sobara.
Mr. Sobera.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Monsieur Coteau.
Monsieur Coteau.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Ms. Thompson.
Miss Thompson.
Carr. Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Ms. Gainey.
Ms. Gainey.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Ms. Lanceman.
Ms. Lanceman.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Ms. Findley.
Ms. Findley.
Mr. Abutayev.
Mr. Abutayev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Chambers. Pardon me, Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Monsieur Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Dreesen.
Mr. Dreesen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk-Provencher.
Mr. Falk-Provencher.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Madame Normandin.
Madame Normandin.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Monsieur Désilé.
Monsieur Désilé.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Collins Victoria.
Miss Collins Victoria.
Ms. Blaney.
Miss Blaney.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Ms. Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Miss May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Vong.
Mr. Vong.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise. The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Anyone new to the channel could like and subscribe to help support the channel. Anyone that would like to can donate to the channel by purchasing a super chat or a sticker. Exactly, Pam. Canada should always come first.
Je désire informer la Chambre.
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Le bureau va mettre.
The honourable member for Beauport, Côte de Beaupré, Île d'Orléans, Charlevoix. Mr. Speaker, I would like to vote in person because my application wasn't working. I was unable to vote remotely. Does the member have unanimous? That's not necessary. Would you just like to indicate your vote? I vote for, Mr. Speaker.
Le bureau va maintenant.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 324, 324. Nays contre, 0, aucun.
I declare the motion carried.
The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion of Mr. Scheer relating to the business of supply. The question is as follows. Mr. Scheer, seconded by Mr. Steinley, moved that given that 70% of provinces and 70% of Canadians oppose the Prime Minister's 23% carbon tax hike on April 1st, the House call on the NDP Liberal coalition to immediately cancel this hike. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Madame Finley.
Miss Finley.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Monsieur Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Culkin.
Mr. Culkins.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Mr. Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Kurrick.
Mr. Kirk.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Dreesen.
Mr. Dreesen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolney.
Mr. Tolney.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reid.
Mr. Reid.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk-Provencher.
Mr. Falk-Provencher.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Monsieur d'Entremont.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Vaughn.
Mr. Vaughn.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Ms. Tassi.
Ms. Tassi.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Chagger.
Ms. Chagger.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Scrow.
Ms. Scrow.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Martinez-Farada.
Madame Martinez-Farada.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Batiste.
Mr. Batiste.
Mr. Kuzmierchuk.
Mr. Kuzmierchuk.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Assassi.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Monsieur Yakano.
Monsieur Yakano.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Dogood.
Mr. Dogood.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Monsieur Sanson.
Mr. Sanson.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Monsieur Robillard.
Mr. Robillard.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Ms. Cedarbrampton South.
Ms. Cedarbrampton South.
Mr. Sobara.
Mr. Sobara.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Mr. Coteau.
Mr. Coteau.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald-Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald-Malpeck.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Ms. Gainey.
Ms. Gainey.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Monsieur Désilé.
Monsieur Désilé.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Collins Victoria.
Ms. Collins Victoria.
Ms. Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Ms. May Saanich Gulf Islands.
Ms. May Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
La Chambre.
The House will now wait for the end of the electronic voting period before resuming its proceedings. I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 119, 119. Nays contre 205, 205.
I declare the motion defeated. The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion of Mr. Scheer relating to the business, on vote C365 under private members' business at second reading. The vote question is as follows.
Alderman Norfolk moved that Bill C-365, an act respecting the implementation of a consumer-led banking system for Canadians, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee of Finance. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the item.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
We will now proceed to members participating in person. All those at my left in favor of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdall.
Mr. Dowdall.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Monsieur Desilets.
Monsieur Desilets.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Canning.
Fifth row to my left.
Mr. Dreesen.
Mr. Dreesen.
Mr. Arnold.
No, Mr. Kitchen.
Pardon me, Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reid.
Mr. Reid.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Madame Sinclair-Degagné.
Madame Sinclair-Degagné.
Ms. Arillo.
Ms. Arillo.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
I will ask. Fourth row to my left.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Troisième rangée à ma
Third row to my left.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Monsieur Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Melillo.
Mr. Melillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Deuxième rangée à ma
Second row to my left.
Kelly.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Ms. Findley.
Ms. Findley.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Ms. Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
First row to my left.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Sixth row to my right in favor of the motion.
Mr. Vaughn.
Mr. Vaughn.
Rangée à ma droite.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Third row to my right, in favor.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Second row to my right in favor.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. McPherson.
McPherson.
First row to my right in favor.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Nous procéderons maintenant aux députés que tous ceux à ma gauche.
All those on my left opposed to the motion will please rise.
Commençons avec le 6e rang.
Starting with the 6th row.
5e rang.
5th row.
3e rang.
3rd row.
2e.
2nd row.
1er rang.
1st row.
Que tous ceux à ma
All those at my right opposed to the motion will please rise.
6e rang.
6th row.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Ms. Taylor Roy.
Ms. Taylor Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Ms. Gainey.
Ms. Gainey.
5th row to my right.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Monsieur Robillard.
Mr. Robillard.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sobara.
Mr. Sobera.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
4e rangée à ma
4th row to my right.
Khoury.
Mr. El Khoury.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Monsieur Yakino.
Monsieur Yakano.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Jauhari.
Mr. Johari.
3e rangée à ma droite.
3rd row to my right.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Madame Fautier.
Madame Fortier.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Batiste.
Mr. Batiste.
Mr. Kuzmierczuk.
Mr. Kuzmierczuk.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Assassi.
2e rang.
2nd row to my right.
Ms. Scrow.
Ms. Scrow.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Madame Martinez Farada.
Madame Martinez Ferrara.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
1e rangée.
1st row to my right.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Ms. Tassie.
Ms. Tassie.
Ms. Chagger.
Ms. Jager.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
La Chambre.
The House will now wait for the end of the electronic voting period before resuming its proceedings.
Anyone new to the channel, please like and subscribe. Share the content with your friends on social media, but make sure that you hit the like button because that helps me fight against the algorithm and it gets more views for the channel.
Je désire informer les députés que la période de vote.
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were unable to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Le bureau va maintenant compiler les résultats.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 172, 172. Nays contre 150, 150.
Je déclare la motion.
I declare the motion carried.
En conséquence, ce projet de loi.
As a result, this bill stands referred to the Standing Committee on Finance. I see that there is a point of order about a vote. The Honourable Minister for Seniors.
The difficulties with the app, I ran back as soon as I could, and I'm hoping that there's unanimous consent to have my vote counted in favour.
Que tous ceux qui s'opposent.
All those opposed to the honourable members moving the motion will please say nay. Accordingly, the House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay.
Adopté. Monsieur le... c'est noté. Oui, je vais faire ça dans un instant. Je vais juste lire, juste terminer les résultats.
Just in a moment, I'll just finish. I wish to inform the House that due to the deferred recorded divisions, government orders will be extended by 36 minutes. The Honourable Member for Terre-Neuve-Jacques-Cartier, on a point of privilege. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, there is a point of privilege. Today is Francophonie Day, and so it's very unfortunate that this has happened. I am raising today a question of privilege about the Liberals' chaotic attempt to amend the NDP opposition motion from Monday. On Monday night, when there was only 1 minute left in debate, the government parliamentary house leader moved a lengthy, complex, and unilingual amendment. After that, there were lengthy procedural debates, as you know. But since the amendment was only available in English, Francophone members were not able to fully participate in deliberations. Additionally, due to translation delays, the members were not able to examine the amendment in French until right before the vote. In my opinion, the government's conduct obstructs the capacity of Francophone members to participate in the work of the House. This is so serious that I believe it constitutes a breach of privilege. According to House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, it says that a member can also face interference in the exercise of their functions through non-physical methods. In judging this type of situation, the Speaker must judge the impact of the situation on members' ability to carry out their parliamentary responsibilities. If the Chair believes that parliamentary responsibilities may have been violated, it is impossible to codify all incidents that could be considered as being cases of interference, obstruction, brutality, or bullying, and which ultimately constitute a prima facie case of privilege. We have the absolute constitutional right to use either official language in parliamentary proceedings. Therefore, the fact that the House leader, who is from Quebec in addition, his actions reduced Quebec Francophone members' ability to participate in important procedural debate. The Honourable Member for Gatineau has ended up making Francophone members here second-tier members. In Standing Order 65, it says that a motion must be tabled in written form before it is put to the vote. When the motion is carried, it must be read out in English and in French. If the Chair is able to use both languages, if not, we'll read it in one language and the clerk will read it in the other before it be placed for debate. But unfortunately, neither the chair nor the clerk were able to read the amendment in French because it didn't exist in French. It's a crying shame. This is shocking. For a country that's officially bilingual, it is in fact embarrassing. The use of both official languages, French and English for those who don't remember it, has had constitutional standing here since Confederation. If you agree, Mr. Speaker, that this is a prima facie breach of privilege, I am ready to present the appropriate motion. Thank you for your attention.
Je vois que le secrétaire parlementaire se lève sur le point.
I see the parliamentary secretary rising on the same point of privilege.
Mr. Speaker, given the nature of the privilege the member has raised, I would take it as notice and report, provide comment in a relatively quick time span for you to make a decision.
Et je reconnais aussi sur la même question de privilège l'honorable.
On the same point of privilege, the honourable member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, I would just like to add that the Bloc Québécois reserves the right to make remarks later after properly analyzing the situation. That was mentioned by my colleague from the Conservative Party.
Et je vois aussi que le député de Mégantic-l'Érable se lève sur...
The member for Mégantic-l'Érable rising on the same point of privilege. Yes, I would just like to add a few points to my colleague for Portneuf, Jacques Cartier's point of privilege to assist in your reflection on the decision to take on this matter. With the adoption of the British North America Act, the greatest legacy of Sir John A. Macdonald and Georges-Étienne Cartier, according to this, members may express themselves in the official language of their choice, and they have been able to do this since the very first sitting of this Parliament. Later, the Translation Bureau was created in 1934 after a stormy debate. The Bureau was asked to cooperate with both chambers of Parliament and to act on their behalf on translation. Later, under the Diefenbaker government, simultaneous interpretation was introduced to the chambers of Parliament. After a commitment made in 1958 by the Progressive Conservative Party in its election agenda. And at the time, ironically, some liberals were against that change. Professor Jean Delisle, in an article about the 50th anniversary of simultaneous interpretation in Parliament, said that even Lester B. Pearson was against it at the time, but that opposition disappeared when Prime Minister Diefenbaker asked the House to approve the measures. More recently, under Brian Mulroney, a great statesman, whose legacy we recently spoke after his decease, the Official Languages Act that we currently have was brought in. It's a quasi-constitutional piece of legislation, and it made simultaneous interpretation in this House a right. It goes without saying that parliamentary bilingualism is a legacy that Conservatives are proud of. This Liberal NDP coalition government doesn't seem to give a fig about this tradition, but we must draw a clear red line against further erosion of the French language in the House of Commons.
On the same point, I see that the honourable member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, is rising on his feet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to add my comments and agree with the question of privilege that was raised. Mr. Speaker, in general, what happened on Monday night was a gross and disgusting violation of the principle of this House being a deliberative assembly of members. The fact that the government put forward a last-minute, very substantive amendment that was not at all debated in this House is disgusting and would not be acceptable in any legislature around the world. It was particularly unfair for the reasons my colleague explained to our Francophone colleagues because of the lack of translation available. In general, the timeline and the process presented by this government seem to try to reduce Parliament to pageantry and theatre rather than recognize our substantive role as the deliberative assembly of one nation in both official languages. This was wrong and unfair in general, but it was particularly unfair to our Francophone colleagues, and I hope you'll find in favour of this question of privilege.
J'apprécie énormément les points de...
I greatly appreciate all of the remarks What I can say is that given the general interest in this question of privilege, and to ensure that the chair will come to a ruling that reflects the concerns raised, especially by the member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier, as well as several colleagues in the House, I would like to inform members that the chair has heard the substantive material of what was expressed and that I will shortly return with a ruling. Thank you.
Monsieur je vais vous laisser très rapidement parce que la présidence, comme...
Very quickly, because as I said, the chair has heard a great deal on this and it will all be integrated into our perspective. The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent, very quickly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, indeed, as a Francophone and proud representative of Louis Saint-Laurent, a Francophone riding in Confederation, I was very insulted about the fact that I had to vote on a text that was entirely in English. But what I wanted to say is that the opposition's parliamentary leader, House leader, gave an alternative saying that we could delay the vote so that the translation could be done properly. So we did give an option, a recommendation, but the government didn't agree, and that's a real shame.
Énormément la présidence maintenant sur ce point d'ordre.
Thank you very much. On this point of order,
from Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston. I just want to let the member know that I have heard a number of points on this issue. The chair is satisfied that he's heard the full range to make an important decision on this issue. It is one which I'll ask the member to be very brief. This will be the last point of order which is going to be heard by the chair on this point. The honourable member from...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate that. What I wanted to point out is something that I think is highly relevant but has not been mentioned in the previous submissions to you, and I think will be of use to you in coming to a decision. It's just this point. We do know that it was 1 minute, more or less, before the end of the debate that this point, this was raised. So 5 minutes, fine, I'm told. The point is this. If you, in the normal course of business, you present a motion in one language only, you do not stop the proceedings for an hour, as actually happened, giving the opportunity for the second language to be produced. You would return to the debate, and if they can get the matter to you in both languages prior to the expiration of the debate, then you'd end things. You do not halt things and allow them to get around to producing things at their convenience. I think that rule would indicate that the wrong approach was taken here, and your guidance in your ruling for future situations of the same sort would be most helpful. Thank you.
I thank the honourable member from Lennox Frontenac, Kingston, for this matter, for raising that point, and the chair will come back to this House. Proceedings. Dépôt de documents.
Tabling of documents.
Il est mon devoir de...
It is my duty to lay upon the table, pursuant to Section 536 of the Canada Elections Act, the report of the Chief Electoral Officer of Canada on the 2023 by-elections. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-3A, this report is deemed permanently referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs.
De la Chambre. L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire du leader du gouvernement en Chambre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Standing Order 36.8a, I have the honour to table in both official languages the government's responses to 18 petitions. These returns will be tabled in an electronic format.
Good job, Kevin.
Dépôt de projet de loi émanant du gouvernement.
Introduction of government bills.
Honorable ministre, Monsieur Leblanc, appuyé par Monsieur.
Mr. Leblanc, seconded by Mr. Sajan, moves for leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Canada Elections Act. This motion is deemed adopted. Mr. Leblanc, seconded by Mr. Sajan, moves that this bill be now read a first time and printed. This motion is deemed adopted.
This bill, première lecture, projet de loi.
Quand ce projet de loi sera...
When will this bill be read a second time? At the next sitting of this House.
Déclaration des ministres.
Statements by ministers. Reports from interparliamentary delegations. The Honourable Member for Glengarry Prescott Russell. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since today is March 20th, I would like to wish you a happy International Day of the Francophonie. And speaking of la Francophonie, I have the honour to table in this House in both official languages the following report of the Canadian branch of the Assemblée Parlementaire de la Francophonie, Bureau meeting and 48th annual session of the Assemblée Parlementaire in Tbilisi, Georgia from July 4th to 8th, 2023, as well as the 38th session of the APF America Regional Assembly Baton Rouge, Louisiana, USA from September 5th to 7th, 2023, as well as the Francophonie mission to the United Nations, New York, September 20th, as well as the report of the Canadian branch for the Leadership Workshop for Parliamentarians Women of the APF, Bucharest, Romania from September 25th to 29th, as well as the Working Group on Reforming the APF Constitution, Geneva, Switzerland from November 23rd to 24th, 2023. Thank you.
Reports from interparliamentary delegations. Presenting reports from committees. The Honourable Member for Edmonton West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have the pleasure and honour to present in both official languages the 17th report of the Standing Committee Government Operations and Estimates, also known as the Mighty OGO, entitled The Question of Privilege Concerning the Refusal to Respond to Questions by Mr. Christian Firth. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Presenting reports from committees. The Honourable Member for Humber River Black Creek.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 1073, I have the honour to present in both official languages the 8th report of the Liaison Committee entitled Committee Activities and Expenditures, April 1st, 2023 to December 31st, 2023. This report highlights the work and accomplishments of each committee, as well as detailing the budgets that fund the activities approved by the committee members. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Presenting reports from committees. Introduction of private members' bills. Mr. Gerritsen, seconded by Mr. Lamoureux, moves for leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Establish Canada's Freshwater Day. This motion is deemed adopted. The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands. I just want to remind the Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby to hold off on his enthusiasm until the Honourable Member actually has an opportunity to speak. The Honourable Member of Kingston and the Islands.
It is an honour, Madam Speaker, to introduce the bill entitled An Act to Establish Fresh Water Day in Canada, and I want to thank the enthusiasm of my NDP colleagues on this. Having said that, Madam Speaker, while I'm on my feet, I move, seconded by the member from Winnipeg North, that we do now move to orders of the day.
Hear, hear. I want to ask the Honourable Member who his seconder was. I think I missed it. Mr. Lamoureux? Okay. Mr. Gerritsen, seconded by Mr. Lamoureux, move that the House do now proceed to orders of the day. Si un député participant en personne désire que la motion soit...
If a member in person would like the motion to be adopted in person, or if they want a recorded division, I would like them to raise. The Honourable Member...
All right, everybody, that's probably going to take forever for them to do that, so don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'm going to end the stream here instead of wasting half an hour waiting for them to get to orders of the day. So have a wonderful night.